This lecture video is on Charles Mills and his book, The Racial Contract. So Charles Mills lived 1951 to 2021 and is famous, for a variety of things, critiquing John Rawls for his book, The Racial Contract, and this idea of a racial contract, his critique of social contract theory, and also his attempt to rescue social contract theory, which is interesting, as well as his critique of ideal theory. And in a way, we'll be looking at all of that in this lecture video. So first, what is social contract theory? So social contract theory can be thought about in explicitly political terms. So the political social contract is kind of an account of the origins of government and our political obligations to it. So these kinds of theories are put forward as a way, typically, right, to justify government. Because we all, if we live in the United States, we pay taxes and we, consent. Well, the question is, do we consent to the authority of the government, right? But in a way, we seem to acknowledge, oh yeah, the government has this authority over us, right? It can tax our money, it can arrest us, or whatever else, right? And the question is, well, how? What's the legitimacy behind that? And social contract theory, in explicitly political terms, says, well, it's justified because of either some kind of tacit consent that citizens give to that government because maybe they use the roads government provides them, or base their lives around the authority of the government in some way. So even though they don't come and actually sign a document that says I consent to the authority of the government, nonetheless, right, seems to be this kind of at least tacit or implicit consent. Or another way of thinking about this is this idea of, well, if we actually were to get together, we would agree, and this is the argument Locke puts forward, we would agree to consent to the government because it's rational to do so, because it protects our private property. So we don't actually have to all sign a document saying we consent to the government. We can just use reason to show, well, if we were in that position, the rational thing to do is consent to government, at least to a government that protects our rights in the case of Locke. Now, another way of thinking about social contract theory is in moral terms, and this is usually meant as a way to establish kind of codes by which citizens are supposed to regulate their behavior. This is kind of used by John Rawls, for example, in his idea of the original position being behind the veil of ignorance. This idea, right, that and not just Rawls, which is still in political terms, but more moral. There are other moral theories as well, right, where it's okay, well, what would we do? What is the right thing to do in any given situation? The ethically right thing to do. And we can use social contract theory to say, well, what would there be unanimous consent to, right, if we were to do something? And you ask, okay, let's use reason to figure out, would everyone agree that such and such is the right thing to do? And then you figure out, okay, well, then that's what people should do. So again, it's this idea of implicit consent, typically through the use of reason to determine what that consent would be, or right, what is the rational thing for all people to agree to, even if no one has actually done that. Now, there are two possible relations between the moral contract and political contract. So first, the moral contract is objective and it is pre-existing. Right? In this way, it is binding in this kind of objectively, perhaps natural way, perhaps by the constitution of our minds, of the use of reason and what it means to be a human being, or through the use of reason to determine, yes, it's objectively true that it would be, that reason says government is justified because we would agree to it, right? So the key point here is this objective sense of social contract theory, and not just objective, but a sense that it is actually prior to even needing to, actual fact, agree to it, right? Now, this is the one that Mills is going to focus on, and this emanates from Locke and Kant's theories of social contract. Now, the second way to think about the relations between the moral and political contract is that the political contract creates morality as a conventionalist set of rules. So that, there is nothing objective that, the social contract has to exist or that it is necessary to exist, but that it exists because humans agree that it exists. And that's it, right? And this we can see most evidently in the philosophy of Hobbes and Rousseau. Okay, now we've seen kind of a summary of social contract theory, and Mills, of course, is going to critique this theory and argue that actually what was developed is what he calls a racial contract. So here he summarizes the racial contract. So this is a socio-political and moral model, right? So that relation together, that explains how society was created. So it's not just a kind of description that often cases the political contract about why something is why something is justified, but also why something ought to be continued, right, into the future. So the normative the normative account instead of not just descriptive. So how it explains how society was created / transformed, how individuals in that society were reconstituted. So not some kind of like before the establishment of like society. No, people were constituted, and then when the racial contract was introduced, human beings were reconstituted, right? What it meant to be a human being, who is determined to be a human being, was changed. How the state was established, and how a particular moral code and certain moral psychology were brought into existence. So Mills says, the racial contract is that set of formal or informal agreements between members of one subset of humans, where the general purpose of the contract is always the differential privileging of the whites as a group with respect to the non-whites as a group, the exploitation of their bodies, land, and resources, and the denial of equal socioeconomic opportunities to them. So the racial contract, right, is a both descriptive model and normative model that says, look, this social contract theory, what it actually did was say there are, humans and then basically kind of subhumans. Humans that are granted rights that privilege them over the subhumans. And this is based on the creation of racial categories, right, as well, because again, right, it is, he's critiquing the subjective account because the objective account wants to say, no, right, coming from Locke and Kant. No. So there are objective reasons why white people should be privileged over non-white people. Now, of course, what Mills is going to show those, again, because the racial contract transformed and reconstituted society, this doesn't mean it's objective. Now, in the social contract, right, the crucial human metamorphosis is from natural man to civil political man, from resident of the state of nature to the citizen of the created society, which is why almost always there's this state of nature theory that accompanies social contract theory, right? And state of nature theory is this idea that there's, how humans existed prior to society, prior to the creation of the social contract. Now, in the racial contract, similarly, there's a metamorphosis, but the crucial metamorphosis here is the preliminary conceptual partitioning and corresponding transformation of human populations into white and non-white men. So, whereas you have natural man, so prior to living in society, who's kind of like savage, doesn't have laws, doesn't have concepts of justice, maybe, or whatever else. In the racial contract, what it says is, well, yeah, you had some like white people that were that lived prior to, of course, the social contract and lived in the state of nature. But it is white people who entered the social contract, and non-white people still remain in this kind of natural state prior to the social contract. Now, because of that, and this is explicitly, we'll see later, argued by Kant, because non-white people don't have their society based on the social contract, then that means those who do live under the social contract have the right to kind of impose their will on them because they're not fully human. They haven't fully used, for example, reason, which distinguishes, at least, this philosophical tradition, distinguishes, humans from non-humans. Now, Mills says the racial contract establishes a racial polity, a racial state, and a racial juridical system, where the status of whites and non-whites is clearly demarcated, whether by law or custom. And the purpose of this state, by contrast with the neutral state of classical contractarianism, is, inter alia, specifically to maintain and reproduce this racial order, securing the privileges and advantages of the full white citizens and maintaining the subordination of non-whites. So this is actually ironic because contractarianism or contractualism is supposedly committed to moral egalitarianism, which is why, right, this idea of the state of nature is all human beings were equal in the state of nature, and then they enter the social contract, right? So equally, all human beings have this potential to enter the social contract. Now, right, this was seen as an advancement in the Enlightenment because it opposed then this kind of moral egalitarianism to the traditionalist hierarchical ideology of the old feudal order, which said, you are bound to the land, and that's, you're a serf, you have to work for the land, because this is custom. This is, in some sense, objective of you as a lesser human than the Lord, right? It's a bit similar to a caste system, although, of course, different. Now, Mills argues, though, right, what happens is this is actually just reformulated, this traditional hierarchical ideology of the old feudal order. It's reformulated in racial terms, where now what is created is a partitioned social ontology. So a kind of social account of how human beings come to exist, how then different human beings come to exist, white and non-white, which then categorizes fully human beings from subhuman beings or subpersons with then, maybe less rights or no rights at all. So there's an epistemological side of the racial contract here that Mills looks at, right? So epistemology is the theory or study of knowledge here. So there's all kinds of ways in which the arguments that try to justify how we can know things about the world are actually based in the racial contract and in a sense then corrupt it. Now, the original intellectual framework was theological, in that there was this idea that what distinguished fully moral human beings from non-fully moral human beings was this difference between the Christians and the heathens, right? Which is why Christians had a right to impose their will on heathens and try to convert them, to be Christian and destroy their culture and so on. Now, the Enlightenment translated this dichotomization into other forms where, Mill says, race became the most dominant. Instead of it being the case that it was Christians versus heathens, it then became the white race versus the other, non-white races. Now, the epistemology of the social contract relies on a sense of natural universal knowledge, which is why, to take Locke, all human beings in the state of nature had the ability to use reason to understand, hey, it's actually, it makes sense, right? It's rational for me to enter into the social contract, to submit to the authority of the state because they will protect my private property, right? So all human beings are understood to have access to reason, which means all human beings can have knowledge about, objective knowledge about the world. Now, what's interesting, though, about the racial contract, right, again, which is meant to show how the social contract is really this kind of perverse contract, is that it relies on misinterpretation. Mill says, thus, in effect, on matters related to race, the racial contract prescribes for its signatories an inverted epistemology, an epistemology of ignorance, a particular pattern of localized and global cognitive dysfunctions, which are psychologically and socially functional, producing the ironic outcome that whites will in general be unable to understand the world they themselves have made. So there will be white mythologies, invented Orients, invented Africas, invented Americas, with a correspondingly fabricated population. Countries that never were, inhabited by people who never were. Right? So all these theories were developed about, these tribes that lived in previously in Africa or South America that were lost to time, where they were, geniuses and then somehow died out. And so all that's left is kind of this not very intelligent, population. And that's why white people, are so much different, because they continued on that path towards enlightenment, right? Or some other mythologies about, the Aryan race, or that, there's this one mythology that was perpetuated by the British, I believe in the 19th century, when they discovered this ruins of an old kingdom in South Africa. And now, they couldn't believe that Africans could have built, this kingdom. So they thought, well, this must have been some long-lost European a group of people that traveled to South Africa and set up this kingdom and then eventually died out, which of course is not, true at all. So continuing, Mills says, one could say then, as a general rule, that white misunderstanding, misrepresentation, evasion, and self-deception on matters related to race are among the most pervasive phenomena of the past few hundred years. A cognitive and moral economy psychically required for conquest, colonization, and enslavement. And I think, I want to pause on that for a moment, because it is well documented that the best way to get soldiers to kill other human beings is to dehumanize them, right? You have to have this kind of false knowledge about, who the enemy is, in such a way that you don't see them as equals. Otherwise, soldiers are probably, they're going to be less likely to kill their fellow human beings, or to enslave them, to colonize them, and so on. He says, and these phenomena are in no way accidental, but prescribed by the terms of the racial contract, which requires a certain schedule of structured blindness and opacities in order to establish and maintain the white polity. What that means is that, white people, he's saying that, and it's hard to say white people because it's not, in some sense, right, white people make up the population that the racial contract serves, but it's more of a white kind of structure. So it's not so much that it's any white person you find, but it's this white structure that was created. And for the most part, it's actually obfuscated. So white people wouldn't even know about this racial contract, right? And this is kind of part of the perniciousness, right, of the racial contract, which is why mythology is so useful, because it works on false truths that better serve the interests of the dominant over the dominated. We also have to look at the economic exploitation of the racial contract. So different political interpretations of the moral egalitarianism of the economics of the social contract are advanced, right? So different interpretations of what that would look like, what the social contract theory entails in terms of, perhaps whether it's moral for equal wealth, or there can be some differences in wealth or redistribution. But he says the idea is that the equality of human beings in the state of nature is carried over into the economy of the socio-political order. That even if under the social contract there might still be some people who have more wealth and some people have less wealth, some people have a higher status and some people a lower status, the idea is that all human beings are really morally equal, which underlies, right, the legitimacy of the social contract, because all human beings agreed to it. Now, the economic dimension of the racial contract is calculatedly aimed at economic exploitation. So Mills says, the whole point of establishing a moral hierarchy and juridically partitioning the polity according to race is to secure and legitimate the privileging of those individuals designated as white or persons, right? So a person is really someone who's white, and the exploitation of those individuals designated as non-white or subpersons. So the whole idea is that those who are exploited are the non-white, the subpersons, and those who are the dominant are the white people, because they're the real fully, human people. And this is seen to some extent, right, in the kind of justification of typically in Anglo-European legacy societies, where you have this kind of like racial wealth gap, right? And there's this sense of, there's this fairness, right? Because really, all human beings, right, would agree to live under the authority of the government according to the social contract theory. But of course, what Mills is trying to say is there's actually this whole kind of substructure that is established that privileges one group of people, the white people, over the non-white people. So it's still assumed, based on the social contract theory, that rationalism and science, innovativeness and inventiveness found their spectral home in Europe. But the secret of primitive accumulation clearly dismisses this, right? And this is one area I think that Mill says that even Marxists have this kind of glorification of Europe as like the home of science and innovation. I don't think that's entirely correct, which is why I mentioned the secret of primitive accumulation, because Marx says that, well, what made capitalism possible was not just like the ingenuity of the white people in Europe, but it was theft and slavery and colonization and so on. But specifically what Mill says about this is that white moral theory's debates on justice in the state must therefore inevitably have a somewhat farcical air, since they ignore the central injustice on which the state rests. No wonder a hypothetical contractarianism that evades the actual circumstances of the polity's founding is preferred, right? So Mills is saying proponents of social contract theory, right, they will ignore the fact that actual history shows there was this injustice where, of course, you have all these people that live in the United States or in other places in Europe or in South America and Africa, South Asia, etc., where they are underdeveloped. Economically, they're more poor. And social contract theory, say, well, yeah, of course, though, but, the social contract theory says that the state is justified because all people are equal. And now that doesn't mean social contract theorists justify the history of what, went on with the colonization, imperialism, enslavement, etc. But what Mills is saying is that what they do is they ignore the fact that history affects people today. That history has baked into the structure a certain way in which non-white people are systemically disadvantaged, and that this isn't an accident because it is rooted in the racial contract. Now, I think it's important to look closer at the philosophical side here of the social contract and the racial contract. So what Mills does is he looks at Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and Kant in their state of nature theories and shows how we might think, okay, look, the history, yes, is full of racism, and so the descriptive aspect of the racial contract can't be denied. But here, Mills wants to say is, no. But also, the moral aspect of the racial contract is true. That social contract theory, the normativity of it, right, endorses racist outcomes. So even the theory can't be saved. So the racial contract created not merely racial exploitation, but race itself as a group identity. That it did not, right, base itself on already, pre-existing racial differences, but actually created racial differences. So he says, white people do not pre-exist, but are brought into existence as whites by the racial contract. Hence, the peculiar transformation of the human population that accompanies this contract. The white race is invented, and one becomes white by law. Now, this is, of course, known historically with the case that The Irish used to be, not considered white. Germans used to be not considered white. Eastern Europeans, Italians used to not be considered white, and so on. The fact that it used to be the case until, I believe, the 1980s that on the census, if you were of Hispanic descent, right, so anywhere in Latin America, you were designated as white until, for political reasons, they decided, no, actually, you're not really white, you're a different kind of race. And there was this whole, actually, Supreme Court case. I can't remember the full title, but it was Thind versus someone. It was someone of Indian descent who said, well, look, like in the, might have been the 19-teens, 1920s, maybe even 1930s. But he said, look, racial, scientists at that time all said that white people descend from the Aryan race. And this guy said, well, look, I'm Indian, and the Aryan race descends from, like northern India. So I am of Aryan descent, which means I am white. And, of course, what happened was the Supreme Court said, well, actually, even though the so-called experts, by their logic, then would have to say that you're white, common knowledge says that you aren't white, so therefore, we're now no longer going to base citizenship on the racial experts, but instead on what is determined to be, common knowledge of racial differences, right? So all these different, ways in which we categorize race, these are created by the racial contract, and in that case, it was meant to ensure that Thind did not get citizenship. Now, we can see this creation of race in each of these theories. First, with Hobbes. So, with Hobbes' state of nature, it never did actually come to exist, but there are examples where pre-social contract existence still occurs, most pointedly with the Native Americans. So, of course, Hobbes says that, prior to the existence of the state, human beings lived kind of as like atomic individuals. They didn't live in societies. They didn't really communicate. It was kind of a war of all against all, where life is nasty, brutish, and short. What happened is, of course, either through rational agreement or by conquest, people submitted to the authority of someone more powerful in order to free themselves of the state of nature. Now, the state of nature might kind of exist in a time of war, but it's still not a full state of nature, right? Only for Hobbes back then was it, in the case of the Native Americans, where the state of nature still existed. And you might think, well, maybe that's because they don't really have like a full legal system, perhaps like what Europeans or the Chinese had. And so in this way, Hobbes isn't being racist. He's just saying, no, like all human beings can free themselves of the state of nature. But Mills points out that there is a tacit racial logic in the text. The literal state of nature is reserved for non-whites. For whites, the state of nature is merely hypothetical. The conflict between whites is the conflict between those with sovereigns, right? So even in a war, it's a conflict between those who have power. People submit to them. So they can't be in a state of nature in that way. That is, those who are already and have always been in society, right? So there's this kind of implicit acknowledgement that for Hobbes, it's white people, Europeans, who have always really been in society, so the state of nature is really hypothetical for Europeans, but for non-whites, like Native Americans, is literal. They live in a state of nature. They don't have a social contract. They don't have a legitimate government. They don't have a government at all, according to Hobbes. So, the most notorious state of nature in the contractarian literature, the bestial war of all against all, is really a non-white figure, a racial object lesson for the more rational whites, whose superior grasp of natural law will enable them to take the necessary steps to avoid it and to not behave as savages, right? Because part of the point of Leviathan for Hobbes was to argue why the English Civil War was very bad, and why civil war is not worth it, even if you live under a brutal government. That a brutal English government is better than living in the state of nature that Native Americans live in, right? So it's a warning for Europeans. Hey, you don't want to be acting like those non-whites over there, right? The barbarians, the savages. Now, how about Locke's state of nature? So, for Locke, the state of nature is normatively regulated by traditional natural law, where private property and money exist, and which is virtually civil, right? So, in the state of nature, of course, then you kind of already have all the social statuses of society. You just don't have protection of that status by a government. So the difference is then you have a government that protects it. Now, it might seem then that, well, yes, everyone has private property. Everyone has this traditional natural law then, and everyone is actually morally equal, even non-white people. But Mill says, though whites share the state of nature for a time with non-whites for Locke, then their residence is necessarily briefer, since whites, by appropriating and adding value to this natural world, exhibit their superior rationality. So the mode of appropriation of Native Americans is no real mode of appropriation at all, yielding property rights that can be readily overridden, if they exist at all, and thereby rendering their territories open for seizure once those who have long since left the state of nature, Europeans, encounter them. So Locke's own political philosophy was used as a justification, of course, to dominate non-white people because, well, they didn't really have private property, because their understanding of property rights was different from the Europeans, and it was the European conception of property rights that was rational. Therefore, because it was rational, and non-white people, if Native Americans didn't have the same conception of private property rights that Europeans did, well, that meant that, they weren't really fully human, because they weren't exhibiting that capacity to use reason, because obviously it's rational to have the European conception of private property rights. Now, how about Rousseau, right? It might seem that with Rousseau, everyone is envisaged as having been in the state of nature at one time or another, because, as Rousseau says, all human beings, right, in the state of nature are this kind of noble savage, right? That all human beings, they weren't necessarily good people because they didn't have a conception of good or evil, but they were benevolent. They were empathetic or sympathetic, specifically is the word he uses, even sometimes to a degree that we might now think is kind of too much. But even Rousseau, Mill says, falls victim to the racial contract. So Mill says the only natural savages for Rousseau are non-white savages, where examples of European savages being restricted to reports of feral children raised by wolves and bears, that Europeans are so intrinsically civilized that it takes upbringing by animals to turn them into savages. So even what might initially seem to be a more open environmental determinism, which would open the door to racial egalitarianism rather than racial hierarchy, it degenerates into massive historical amnesia and factual misrepresentation driven by the presuppositions of the racial contract. That for Rousseau, when he tries to apply his theory, the only time he can actually say when Europeans became that kind of noble savage of the state of nature, it was when they were raised by wolves and bears. And yet he could point to savages in, for example, the Americas, Native Americans and so on. So there's the difference where Native Americans don't have to be raised by wolves and bears to be savages, but Europeans have to be raised by wolves and bears, which means there's an extra step that Europeans have to take to enter back, or to fall back into the state of nature. Now, Kant doesn't really have a state of nature theory, but the kind of racial aspect of personhood in him is even more evident than Hobbes, Locke, or Rousseau. So, for Kant's theory of personhood, human beings are endowed with innate reason and are therefore autonomous agents. So why are human beings endowed with innate reason? Well, all human beings can will something universally. Like, for example, they can say, well, if I like the car that my friend has, would it be morally right for me to just go and take that car from my friend? Kant says, well, can you will that action universally, such that if everyone were to do it, right? Would it be possible? And reason would say no, because it's contradictory, that you wouldn't be able to will that in the first place, because if everyone were to just steal a car from their friend, you would never have friends, because no one would trust you in the first place. So you could never steal that car in the first place, because there's a basic sense of trust that exists between friends, or just citizens in a society. And all humans are capable of using reason in this universal moral sense, right? That's what autonomy is the ability to use reason without being influenced by the external world, by desires, by feelings, etc. Now, even then, though, Mills shows personhood for Kant is dependent on race. And Kant is, therefore, the father of actually the modern conception of race. For him, comments George Moss, racial makeup becomes an unchanging substance and the foundation of all physical appearance and human development, including intelligence. The famous theorist of personhood is also the theorist of subpersonhood, though this distinction is, in what the suspicious might almost think a conspiracy to conceal embarrassing truths, far less known. I mean, it's actually very clear how Kant's philosophy could be used in racial ways, because Kant himself justified colonialism on the grounds that non-white people did not have a government based on reason. Therefore, Europeans had a duty to colonize non-white people, to install a rational government for them. So all of these, this look at these four different theories is meant to show that the racial contract underwrites the social contract, and that the racial contract is a visible or hidden operator that restricts and modifies the scope of its prescriptions. Still to this day, Mills says, the racial contract is being continually rewritten to create different forms of the racial polity. That even someone like John Rawls, who says, like, look, we need to go behind this veil of ignorance, where we say, what would a theory of justice, what kind of theory of justice would it be that all placed behind a veil of ignorance, where they don't know whether they would be black or white in that society, would agree to, right? That seems like the best way to come up with the most racially egalitarian theory of justice. But even then, Mills shows how that is another case of the racial contract being kind of rewritten. Now, this leads us to then part of the critique that the racial contract, as articulated by Mills, is making. And it is arguing that these kind of approaches to justice, which ask, what is justice in ideal conditions, such that, like John Rawls does, or even, Kant does, or we could even say Locke, what they do is that they are really engaging in ideology, a kind of pernicious, subversive ideology. So it was Rawls who made this distinction between what he called ideal theory and non-ideal theory, where ideal theory assumes strict compliance. It says, okay, what is if we want to imagine what justice is, we would want to imagine what is the kind of society that existed where all people would abide by the laws and moral rules, right? So what ideal theory does is constructs the end, right, the best society within the limits of practical possibility. Now, Rawls juxtaposed this to what he called non-ideal theory. So whereas ideal theory says, okay, what would ideal justice be such that we would want to work towards it? Non-ideal theory says, okay, but because we don't have that, we have to deal with the injustices that exist now. So the idea is that ideal theory tells us what we should work towards, what is really just, and then we use that to inform non-ideal theory. We use that to inform theory that tackles injustices now. Now, this might seem like, of course, the rational way to approach justice. But once again, Mills shows, actually, this is not the case. So what this does is it reifies injustice. That ideal theory is really just ideology, deleteriously reifying forms of hegemony. reifying forms of racism, of classism, etc., sexism, and so on. So as an ideology, it is, Mill says, a distortional complex of ideas, values, norms, and beliefs that reflects the non-representative interests and experiences of a small minority of the national population, of typically middle to upper class white males who are hugely overrepresented in the professional philosophical population. That what it does is it says, because again, we might think, well, look, the best way to figure out what is just is to say, imagine you don't know if you were going to be white or black. Well, the rational thing to do would be, well, if I don't know whether I'm going to be white or black, I'm probably not going to agree to a system of justice that privileges white people over black people because I could end up being black in that society. But what Mill says is that's nonsense, right? When you abstract like that, you begin with all sorts of presuppositions that we already know then come from the racial contract, because the racial contract underwrites the social contract. So it is a mistake to engage in ideal theory. It is a mistake to approach the problem of justice from the question, what is just, or what is justice? Now, it might seem then that social contract theory is irretrievable as a moral or political ideal. But what's interesting is Mill still works within the liberal tradition. He doesn't reject liberalism, right? He wants to, in a sense, kind of radically, but really reform liberalism to account for the racial contract. So he does this by approaching the question of justice from the facts of injustice. He doesn't ask, what is justice? He says, let's look at injustice as it exists right now and tackle that. So if then the apparatus of social contract theory is modified to deal with the non-ideal facts, right, facts of partial compliance to moral and just rules and in cases of injustice, then it's imperative, the imperative of social contract theory would be on eliminating structures of socio-political domination that preclude the realization of genuine equality for the majority of the population. And one example of this he gives is actually Rousseau's demystificatory domination contract, where Rousseau in the Second Discourse, right, he argues that society is based on a kind of lie, where the wealthier came to the poorer people and said, hey, enter into an association with us and we will protect you. But really it was for the benefit of the wealthy people because they had everything to lose and the poor people had nothing to lose, right? So it was a kind of a ruse over on the poorer people. And so here Rousseau is saying, look, this was an unjust situation, so we need to get rid of that injustice. And so Mills is saying that's what we need to do, is we need to look at where does injustice exist, not ask what is justice and then try to work towards it, but try to eliminate injustice. Just focus on the injustice. In the same way that we can focus on the class contract, where perhaps, we can look at class conflict and the way in which the working class can be exploited. We can look at the sexual contract, the way in which a certain sex, the female sex, can be exploited by the male sex. Or we can look at the racial contract, as Mills has been doing, and that these can serve as insightful starting points. So what we do is actually begin with the question of injustice as opposed to justice. This is what I find the most interesting because it seems counterintuitive. But as Mills says, making oppression central would mean that from the start, we would be locating ourselves unequivocally on the terrain of non-ideal theory. We would be starting from the facts as they actually exist, not assuming the facts that we would like to exist. The normative project would then no longer be adjudication of competing versions of an ideally just social order, but rather the adjudication of competing policies for redressing social injustice. The evasion in the Rawls literature would no longer be possible, and that obviously would be a very different variety of contractarianism.